Everybody's favorite task in the whole wide world, soldering. Gonna rewire an XR10 Pro G2, take off all the original wires, put on some fresh wires, talk about plugs, soldering, tools, all that fun stuff. Alright, so the main thing you want to do is before you start is clean your speed control kind of top to bottom. I like to use a small brush, make sure you get all the dust out of there. This particular one was already clean, so we don't have to do too much of that. And once you get everything cleaned off, you can get down to, I guess, disassembly prep, removing any sort of insulation and stuff like that. I tend to go one wire at a time just to avoid shorting anything. Main thing that folks ask is soldering iron stuff. The tip of your iron, I like to use a chisel tip that's, you know, pretty decent size, or I just got one of these, TS100 style. This is the 1-up version, which is very nice. Comes with the larger tip, which is good for normal 10 scale, 12 scale, even 8 scale stuff. You can solder with this iron, no problem. It gets good and hot. But this is my normal Haku station that I have on my workbench, and then I've got this guy that I travel with now that runs off a regular 6S LiPo, plugs in with this little jack, or if you have a power supply you can plug it in too. But these are great. They get up to the same temperature that my big one does, has interchangeable tips and all that. If you've been around drone racing, you've seen these, and in the RC car world, Randy from 1-up just started packaging these with these nice little carry cases and the whole 9 yards. But let's get down to business of removing some wires. I get a lot of questions from folks that are working on a speed control for maybe the first or the second time, and they can never get the solder off. The speed controls come with a lead-free solder that's a very high temperature, so you usually have to have a good iron, and if you think that you have a good iron and it's not doing the job, a little bit of flux goes a very long way to helping that stuff flow. I have liquid flux, or you can do flux paste, and it just helps kind of get the heat going and get everything up in there. And first thing I do is take the power cap off, because that gets me down into the wires, and we're doing a full rewire on this guy, so we're gonna go all the way. Now, pro tip, like if you're having a hard time and everything's moving around on you, oops, push the button, there's you can grab your electronics with like a pair of vice grips or something, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. See, that's not wanting to flow, and then I get it one more time and give the wire a little pull. That's not coming off at all. So the trick, get in there with some fresh solder. And then usually a little bit of tension on the wire is all it takes, but these guys are really on there. There we go. You see a little solder splash there? That's always bad. Make sure you get that out of there. I got a little sponge up here with some water on it, and what you do there is to clean the tip off so that all these contaminants don't stay in there. But like I was saying, if you need to, like I have a set of vice grips that I use that you can grab either plugs with to solder, or you can even use it to set the speed control on if it's wiggling around too much. For the most part, I tend to just pin it down with one hand and then get after it with the solder with the other hand. Oh God. What a mess. So I got it laid on its side. I'm hitting the iron right across the top, trying to, anyway. And as you can see, this is no joke. This stuff doesn't want to come off. Real high temperature. Alright, so finally, get that one off. Now, next thing I'm going to do is check it. How hot does it feel? Does it feel any temperature in here? Have you been soldering on this thing too long? If I do, I just give it a second, let it cool down a bit. We're going to go one by one across the edge just to make it easy to get the iron down in there. So I'm going to peel the, it's like a silicone insulator tube type looking thing. And this will let me kind of get down right on the edge. And then my other pro tip that I like is if this thing's super hard to manage, I'll take a piece of double-side tape and I will actually tape it to the table so that I can at least pay attention to what I'm doing. Rub that on there. All right, so then you can take this guy. Which way should we do this? Probably like this. Tape him out of the table, and that way it doesn't wiggle around so much. All right, so iron is good and hot. This guy is secure. I'm gonna tin our tip. I'm gonna put some solder down in here. And then let's see if we can get this guy to flow. Give the wire a little twist. That's kind of my trick, is to twist the wire. And then it comes right, oh, almost, so close. Got it up under there, and then it comes right out. So that's not terrible. It's not great, but gets the job done. So I take my time in between to let everything kind of cool down here, and go in there, let it flow for a second, give the wire a little twist, and a little gentle pull. And usually it wants to come right out, but this one is being extremely difficult. Ah, there we go. There, comes right out. The twist, I think, is the key to the whole process. So, and then I take my brush, make sure that I clean any debris out now so that it doesn't reflow later. And then we're gonna slide this guy up. It's not a terrible thing to take your time between the solder joints just to let the speed control cool down. You're putting an 800-degree iron onto the sensitive parts of the speed control. So a little tin here, a little tin here, and then you let it flow for just a moment. 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, give it a twist, and it should come right out. Doesn't want it, there it goes. Oh, that's lame. Man, that one is not cooperating. More solder. There we go. Ah, whew. That's not the way to do it. That was a bad one because I splashed solder pretty much everywhere. A little too much tension, not enough patience. Feel everything. It's not really hot, but it is warm, so give it just a moment here to cool down. And then while that's happening, I can prep my other wires. So while that cools down, you know, you don't want to waste a bunch of time just sitting around doing nothing. So I'm gonna strip and tin these guys and put my plug on. And this, I'm not a fan of bullet plugs. These have their own sets of problems. So I'm gonna solder my XT90 that we're putting on this setup onto the other side. Why do I like AMAS plugs? Because it's a cup, it's not a tube. A lot of the plugs that are tubes that you solder into, the wire is floating in a pool of solder. With this style, the wire is actually going to sit down on the cup, and there's going to be more surface area of the wire making contact with the plug. I guess common mistake is that solder is a terrible conductor. You just want to use it to hold your wires in place. So kind of the more wire touches the surface of the connector, the better off you're going to be as far as like high power stuff. We run into a lot of shutdown issues and goofy things happening with the speed controls, basically related to bad connectors. If anybody's called tech support and talked to me, like the #1 thing I talk about is try replacing the plugs, even if you think they're okay, even if everything works all right on something else. And you guys can see there's a lot of wire shards coming off here because my wire strippers are too small for this. So I'm catching, and I'm trying to make sure that I twist all these out of here and get them off to the side, because I definitely don't want all those wire shards in my electronics, because that is always bad. All right, so when I do a set of plugs, I tend to take this guy, and then I like to, the best way to do it is to plug the other end of the plug in there to act as kind of a heat sink so you're not melting the plastic. This should be pretty quick and easy, so I'm hoping that won't be much of an issue. But open this guy up, and then make sure it's kind of firm. You can lay that, you see that? See that? Get it over there maybe. This is now stuck to the table, so kind of in the way. Put that, when I tin wires, I try to have them lay sideways so that the solder doesn't run up the wire. I've talked about that a few times, but I like to mention it every time because it's kind of one of them deals with soldering that you don't want. Solder seems like you're going to solder, you need to use lots of solder, but that's kind of the opposite in most of the setups. So I'm just lacing some in here. It's rolling down through and onto the bottom side. I'm going to tin this side, and then this is the negative side. The XT90s, this is an XT90 from AMAS, and it's marked both sides, positive and negative. These are those plugs that you can't plug in backwards. And then a little bit more solder on here just to make sure. I got a couple strands that were still exposed, like loose, untinned. So hold the wire upside down like that so that it all flows down to the bottom. And then that is probably not going to show up. But the idea here is that you got a uniform solder on there that's not kind of blobbed up anywhere, and you can still see the strands of the wire underneath. And then let's see where I can put this. And then that means that if that's soldered or tinned correctly, I do one fresh one there, and I just take this guy, heat on top of the wire. Once it all starts to flow, I give the wire a little twist and a roll in, and I'm done. Quick as that. So the wire pushes all the way through the solder, sits down on the actual connector, and that's kind of the important part of the whole process, is that the wire is not floating in solder, it's not sitting in a pool of solder, that you have kind of as little solder as possible, but enough to hold it all in place. So you have to have solder everywhere, but you can't have too much solder everywhere, if that makes any sense. So this one, again, I'm doing this, oops, gonna heat it up and let the solder flow all the way around, rolling it the same way that I twisted the wires, and then I get a nice kind of uniform, but not a blob of solder. Put a fresh dabber in there, and then lay this down across the top. Give it a twist as I go to keep all the wires nice and tight, and kind of push it in at the same time. And that is it. So plug wires are installed, and in that time the speed control is all cooled down again. So you're thinking he didn't put his thing on. It's fine, because I'm going to cut these off. Oh man, I made a wire mess because the way I cut that was lame. So now that's a good pro tip here, is like if you realize that you've made a metal mess everywhere, that's going to be bad later. You're going to stop and clean all this up. So we're going to do that next. So I did 3 wires, took a little break, going to do the last 2 wires now. The little break was done to strip tin, set that up, and this way the speed control doesn't get overheated or excessive heat that it doesn't normally see, and lets us get all this stuff taken care of nicely. Maybe. Oh wait, I gotta crank this thing all the way up. Boop, 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 boop. No, it really doesn't want to come out of there, even with my twist. This is a little on the risky side, I think. Whoa, I just bridged them together. So that's what happens when you get a whole bunch of solder in there. It makes a big mess, and then it makes it very hard to get things out. There we go. All right, blob. Gonna get that blob out of there. This is not a very professional situation, folks. I'm gonna tell you that right now. Not my finest work. All right, so peel this guy back so we can get in here. Now, as much as that took, it's pretty warm. Like, it's not hot by any means, but it is warm. So you can see that was right at the edge of taking too long. All right, so tin, apply a little bit more, give it a twist. And that's the way it's supposed to happen. I think the problem was I wasn't able to really twist the battery wires very well because they're still soldered onto the plug. The motor wires all came off very easily. And then what I tend to do is take each of the cups and I hold the speed control upside down and I drain the solder down onto the iron tip to get some of the excess solder out of there. And I wipe it over on the sponge. Kind of do the same thing along each of them, so that you get some of the solder out of the cups, because there's a ton of solder in there. And these are moves you want to do quick, because when the iron isn't on the speed control anymore, you're real inclined to get the cups, these solder posts, unsoldered from the tab, and that you don't want that. Once we get a good most of the solder out of here, you want to have it so that it's not pooled up, that you can see the cup again. So it's still got, I don't know, let's see how there's still solder in there. I want to try to get it so that I can get down to the cup. So sometimes you got to give her a little tap on the table, going like that. That is not approved, because if you do this wrong, that thing will pop out. So this is one I've got a lot of practice with, and I will tell you, this is a great way to ruin your solder job because you'll pop these cups out. I've done it once or twice. So now I'm getting a little better at it. The other one that's good here is to use a little bit of solder wick. If you have a solder sucker or some solder wick, that's way better than this technique. But this is one that I've had to do like in the field when I don't have all my stuff, and it's better than all this old solder and nastiness hanging out here. Now we can kind of see the cups. Got most of the solder out there. None of the tabs moved or twisted. They're still straight. They're all still flush, and that's what you're worried about. So now I got all this solder on the table. I'm gonna clean that off. Now we're gonna put the wires back on. It's marked A, B, and C. Blue, yellow, orange. Bring your own ABC. Blue, yellow, orange. Bring your own. It's real easy. I am going to put on some heavy duty 12 gaugers. These come pre-tinned, which is good. A lot of times if you're not using lead-free solder, you want to cut all this off and re-tin them with the solder that you are using. Again, these strippers are not like the right size for this, so I'm trying to be extra careful to not squeeze it very hard and not break the wires off the edge, because when you strip wires with like a pair of scissors or a knife or the wrong size like I've kind of been doing here, you get these little wire strands that will ruin everything. I've had folks resolder things and not pay much attention to this, you know, clean bench like I was doing earlier, and you'll get solder balls, you'll get solder strands, little wire stuff everywhere that really will make your soldering no fun. So twist these nice and tight, and then what I tend to do is lay all three of them down flat on top of my clippers, or if you do like this and grab them all, that's a pretty nice way to do it, so that you can take this guy, set them on your strippers like that, and they all stay in place and you can solder them. So usually just put some on top and then you come back to it, let it flow. This is moving all over the place. I feel like now that I'm doing this on video, it doesn't work nearly as good as when I sit here and not talk about it. And yeah, I got super shaky hands. I always have. And I don't know many coffees this morning also. All right. So get the gist of it done there. Pop these guys out, and then I come back with them going downhill so the solder flows off the edge. Give the wire a little roll like that. Again, it's the same kind of bit where you want to have not a blob of solder on there, so the wires are still, the strands of the wires can be seen just a little bit. Pro tip, super dull X-Acto knife. Works real good to do that, and you don't get the strands either. But you also barely cut the edge of the insulation. All right, so we got all that out of the way, and I think my battery just died, so we're switching over to the big dog. This battery, just to be clear, has been used for many soldering projects. I probably should have charged it all the way up before I started, but I didn't. So next up is putting all the wires onto this guy. We got decent tin job, decent tin job on everything here, and I think I'm going to do a little bit of shrink tubing down on each of the wires to keep it protected. And we're also going to do the upgraded power cap. This is the quad cap that is for specifically for 2S. This is going to go into a no prep drag racer, so we're going to get a little extra oomph with the big cap. So start out, we took all that solder out, but we got to put a little bit of fresh of our regular good old-fashioned solder in here to get everything flowing a bit. And then I'm probably going to give these guys a little dinker like this. Get all the solder to kind of sit out of the cup, down on the bottom. Like that. And then, so the trick to this guy is very much in the cleanliness of your tin job here on the wires. So I'm just going to touch these up one more time to make sure that these are nice and tight. Give it a twist as I go. It's Not looking very good. There we go. A little bit more solder. A little roll. So I'm trying to hold this down all while doing this. It's a lot easier if you clamp the speed control down to something. I'm out of double side tape. My kingdom for some double side tape. So that gets it down in there, one quick shot like that, and then I just go back and touch it up with a little bit more pressure and a touch of solder to make sure it sits all the way down in there. A little pressure this way and pressure this way. And then you want to take a real close look at it and make sure you don't have any wire strands hanging out doing goofy stuff. And it looks like we're all clear there. So this is A, which is the blue one. Put the blue shrink wrap on there. A, and the next one's positive, B, negative, C. So you can do motor wires first or kind of come back. I like to do them in order. It just makes it a little bit easier for keeping things nice and clean. And you can not sandwich them. So next up is my positive. So again, the trick to these is always in how clean your guys on the end here. And this is why I like to have a Ward bench, because sometimes you got to give it a little push on the bench and a twist to make sure all the wires are nice and tight. That way you don't get any flyers. And then get yourself lined up here. Now this wire is a little bit too big for the cup, so this is going to be real tricky. I want to try to get all the solder out of here first, so that I can get the wire all the way in there. Ooh, that was bad. Don't do it that way, kids. So when you do that, you'll get all these errant strands of wire or solder splashes between and behind. So you gotta make sure you get in there, give it a tap, and you'll see a bunch of solder came out. And that's all sorts of bad. So cups good and empty now. I got all the solder splashes, little balls out of there. We're gonna hit it one more time with the brush just to make sure. And then I see one little guy right there that can pop up. I'm sure there's people at home that know how to solder better than I do that are cringing at all of this right now. For this part, I definitely need to like handle the speed control a little bit more, so I'm gonna clamp her down. Don't laugh, I get it. I got a bigger vice grip, so I put some tape on the case and I just gently grabbed it. And this is just so it holds still, because this way my hands are a little more able to do what I need to do. Anytime I go to put the wire on, I tend to tag it with a little bit of solder. It just seems to make everything flow better when you get in there. Lay it into the cup, real gently give it a twist and push down. And that is about all the space that you get, maybe a little bit more. That is not that pretty. Man, I really don't like that. Oh, this one's got a ton of solder in here, so we're gonna get some of this out. Oh, look at that. I even have solder wick. Look at that, so much better. So, I don't know, if you don't know what solder wick is like a copper braid that you can get, lay onto something. It pulls all the solder right out of the cup in one felt swoop. That's the right way to do it. Okay, so that's on there. I got the solder out with the solder wick. So close. So the problem here is these wires are a little bit bigger than this speed control is set up for, because these cups are all made for only 12 gauge wire, and this is 10 gauge power wire. So this is real bad idea. And power cap. So the power cap, the shorter you can make these wires, the better power cap's gonna perform. So I tend to run these like right on the back side of the speed control and keep them, you know, relatively short. Sometimes guys will put them on the other side and it's only a little bit longer, but I try to keep it like as short as possible, maybe even lay it down flat like that when you're in the car. But so for this, we're gonna try to make it so it sits right about there. And then these wires get soldered bang bang right on top of those guys. I try to get it down at the base of the speed control as much as I can so that it gets down onto the solder post just a little bit. See there, everything is insulated from each other so that in case anything did happen or there's some loose strands, but thanks to good tinning, we feel pretty confident that that's all okay. So give this guy a nice once over with the brush, make sure everything's all right, clean off your table. Okay, so just a quick recap. I use a leaded solder most of the time when I'm at home because that's easier to work with. Most of the speed controls come with a high silver content lead-free solder that's very high temperature. It's better for the earth when they recycle and stuff like that because there's no lead in it, but it's just harder to work with. For international packages shipped, when you do things correctly, you want to have something called solder wick. It's a copper material that lets you pull the solder off the tabs instead of doing it all those wrong ways that I showed you. Tapping speed control, scooping it out with the iron, all that, it's okay, it gets the job done, but to do it right, you want to have a little bit of solder wick, because you saw how quick it was. You just tap it in there and it comes right out. Stripping and tinning wires is very important, not just the tinning, but how you strip the wires so you don't get the strands of wire everywhere, and then letting the speed control cool down in between sessions. You can remove a couple wires, prep some wires, and then, you know, kind of back and forth like that so that you don't overheat the speed control as you're working and you don't waste a ton of time. Power caps always go right on top of the speed controls tabs. Sometimes I see people try to put them up on the wire because of the way it's set up. The closer you can get it to the speed control, the better the power cap's going to work. And for the most part, you never really have too much cap, as far as I know. Sometimes the caps ratings are going to affect how well they work. We do a bunch of caps that are, you know, specific to the applications, and these days there's a bunch of big power caps that are coming out there, so you need to be a little careful. Some of that stuff's not really any better than what it is, than the stuff that we sell them with, because caps are, it's a black art in some regards. But other than that, soldering 101, good strippers, good solder, good hot iron. Like I said, you want to have decent size tips. The two that I used were these two. If you do have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, charlie@hobbywing.com. Thanks a lot.